It's one of those moments, just seared into our collective memory.
Yeah.
A bright sunny day in Dallas, a motorcade, and then shots ringing out,
Yeah.
the assassination of JFK.
Mm.
Even decades later, it's hard to grasp how one man could have altered the course of history so violently.
Yeah.
Today we're going to try to understand Lee Harvey Oswald, the man who pulled the trigger.
It's fascinating, isn't it? We're going to delve into his life, explore the evidence, and see why, despite all the conspiracy theories, his story remains the most plausible explanation.
We've got a stack of sources here. Psychological reports, witness testimonies, even some declassified files that paint a pretty complex picture of this guy.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Okay.
The early years, Oswald's childhood was, well, to put it mildly, tough.
Yes. A difficult mother, constant moving, a sense of rootlessness, these things leave their mark. And we see it reflected in those psychological reports. They describe him as detached, withdrawn, almost like he felt cheated by life.
That feeling of being a nobody of life, having conspired against him. I remember reading somewhere that that's a pretty common thread among assassins.
You're absolutely right. There's often this desperate need to be recognized, to become someone, even if it's through infamy. And Oswald's early interest in socialism and Marxism, that too speaks volumes.
It does seem odd, though, a Marxist joining the U.S. Marines that's practically begging for internal conflict, doesn't it?
It might seem contradictory, but for Oswald, the Marines were a path to belonging to structure and, crucially, marksmanship training.
Yeah.
It's almost chilling in hindsight. Now, what's interesting is that even his fellow Marines just saw his interest in Russia as a bit of an eccentricity, not a sign of future defection.
But then he defects to the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War. That's not just eccentric, that's a huge leap.
What's fascinating here is that even the Soviets and Americans, after investigating him, saw him as insignificant, a loser, not a spy. This defection wasn't about ideology alone. It was about escaping his life, making a statement.
So he gets to the Soviet Union expecting to be welcomed as a hero. And instead,
disillusionment sets in a few miserable years in Minsk, a marriage to Marina Prusakova, and ultimately a return to the U.S. with their child.
and back in the U.S., things didn't magically get better, did they?
No, not at all. He struggled to hold down jobs, had a violent temper, and became increasingly obsessed with Cuba and its revolution. And this obsession led to a truly chilling act: the attempted assassination of Major General Edwin Walker, a prominent right-wing figure.
So we see a pattern emerging here. A deeply troubled individual yearning for significance, drawn to extremist ideologies, and now willing to act on those beliefs with violence.
Right.
This begs the question, how did he even get the opportunity to target Kennedy? Their worlds seemed miles apart.
And this is where fate, or perhaps just terrible coincidence, comes into play. The Dallas newspapers announce Kennedy's visit. The motorcade route is published a route that happens to pass by the Texas School Book Depository.
Where Oswald just happened to be working.
Precisely, almost as if destiny had handed him the opportunity on a silver platter. Was this the moment Oswald saw his chance to become more than a nobody, to make history, even if it meant becoming an infamous assassin? It's almost too much of a coincidence, isn't it? It makes you wonder if there's a deeper meaning, a force at play that we can't fully grasp.
That's what fuels those conspiracy theories, right? The need to believe there's more to the story than just a random act of violence. But before we go down that rabbit hole, let's look at the evidence, what convinced the Dallas police that Oswald was the lone gunman.
There's actually quite a bit of evidence pointing directly at Oswald. For starters, he bought the rifle under an assumed name months before the assassination.
So premeditation was definitely involved. That adds another layer to his mindset, doesn't it? It wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment decision.
Exactly. Then you have witness accounts putting a shooter on the 6th floor of the depository, right where Oswald worked. And of course, there's the discovery of the sniper's nest and the rifle itself.
But couldn't that have been planted? I mean, that's what a lot of the conspiracy theories hinge on, right?
That's a common argument, but there's more. Oswald was the only employee to leave the building immediately after the shooting. He then took a taxi, retrieved his revolver, and fatally shot Officer J.D. Tippett.
Wait, he shot a police officer. That changes things.
It certainly does. It demonstrates a pattern of escalating violence, a disregard for authority that goes beyond just targeting the president. And when he was finally arrested, he resisted and was defiant during interrogation. He lied, gave inconsistent statements. Even his own wife and brother believed he was guilty.
That's a lot to process. I'm starting to see why the official explanation holds up. But what about those counter-arguments? The magic bullet theory, for example, and doubts about Oswald's shooting ability. Those are pretty widespread.
They are, and they're worth addressing. The magic bullet theory claims that a single bullet caused all of the wounds to both President Kennedy and Governor Connolly, who was also in the car. It's seen as implausible by some because of the bullet's trajectory and the number of wounds.
So how do ballistic experts explain that?
Well, while it's a complex trajectory, recreations and analysis have shown it's within the realm of possibility, especially given the layout of the car and the positions of the victims. As for Oswald's shooting ability, he wasn't an expert marksman, but he wasn't a novice either. His Marine training would have given him enough skill to make those shots, particularly from an elevated position with a scope.
It's unsettling to think that someone with relatively basic training could pull off something so devastating. But if we connect all this back to Oswald, it seems like his actions were driven by this toxic mix of resentment and a desperate desire for significance.
Absolutely. Kennedy, with his charisma, success, and embodiment of American power, would have represented everything Oswald felt he lacked and resented. It's almost as if, in his warped worldview, striking at Kennedy was a way to strike at the very system that had failed him.
That's a bleak thought, but it makes a strange kind of sense. So we've got a troubled individual extremist beliefs, the opportunity falling into his lap, and then the evidence stacking up against him. But even with all that, the Kennedy assassination continues to fascinate and fuel conspiracy theories. Why is that? Decades later, it still grips our imagination.
Part of it, I think, is the sheer trauma of the event itself. The assassination of a young, charismatic president in broad daylight. It was a national wound, a loss of innocence for America.
Like we as a nation lost something more than just a leader. We lost a sense of security, of predictability.
Exactly. And when confronted with such a horrific event, people naturally crave explanations, narratives that go beyond a lone gunman with a troubled past. They search for deeper meaning for a grand conspiracy, because a random act of violence feels too senseless, too unbearable.
It's almost as if a conspiracy theory, however outlandish, offers a sense of control of order in a world that suddenly seems chaotic and unpredictable.
That's a very insightful point. And the rise of Kennedy conspiracy theories also reflects a broader trend, a growing distrust in authority and institutions. It's the idea that powerful unseen forces, a deep state, are pulling the strings behind the scenes.
That phrase deep state, it gets thrown around a lot these days. What does it really mean?
It refers to this idea of a hidden network within the government operating outside of public scrutiny, manipulating events for their own agenda. It's a concept that's been around for decades, often associated with conspiracy theories.
So in a way, the Kennedy assassination becomes a touchstone for this distrust, a symbol of how those in power can't be trusted.
Precisely, and sadly, this distrust has only grown in recent years, fueled by political polarization and the spread of misinformation online. It's become a powerful force shaping how we view the world and undermining our faith in institutions.
This has been heavy, but also incredibly enlightening. It's amazing how much we can learn from a single event, even one that happened so long ago.
It's a testament to the power of history, to how it continues to shape our understanding of the present. The Kennedy assassination reminds us that individual actions can have profound consequences, that even the most powerful figures are vulnerable, and that the search for truth is often a complex and challenging journey.
And speaking of journeys, there's one aspect of Oswald's life we haven't touched on yet. His time in New Orleans, it seems like that was a crucial period for his development as a radical, for lack of a better word.
You're absolutely right. New Orleans was a turning point for Oswald. It's where his political activism really took shape and where he first attracted the attention of the FBI.
New Orleans in the early 60s. I mean, it must have been a hotbed of political activity with the civil rights movement gaining momentum and the Cold War casting its long shadow.
Absolutely. And Oswald, ever the contrarian, gravitated towards a pro-Castro group. The Fair Play for Cuba Committee, remember, this was during the peak of U.S.-Cuban tensions just a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis.
So he's openly supporting a communist regime while living in the United States. That's bold, to say the least. Was he trying to provoke a reaction?
There's certainly an element of that Oswald seemed to thrive on, being the outsider, the provocateur. He got into a scuffle with some anti-Castro activists, distributed pro-Castro leaflets. He even had a radio debate that got him on the FBI's radar.
It's like he was trying to create a persona to make himself bigger than he was.
Yes, and this desire for attention, for notoriety, ultimately led him to Mexico City just a few months before the assassination.
Mexico City, what was he doing there?
He was trying to get visas to travel to Cuba and the Soviet Union. Imagine that even after his disillusioning experience in the Soviet Union, he was still clinging to this idea of defecting, of finding a place where he truly belonged.
It's almost heartbreaking, isn't it? This constant searching for meaning, for belonging, and ultimately finding it in the most destructive way imaginable.
It does make you wonder about the what ifs. What if he had found a different outlet for his frustrations, his anger? What if he had never gotten that job at the book depository?
The ripple effects of those small choices are just staggering.
It's a sobering thought, and it speaks to the fragility of history, to how seemingly insignificant events can lead to monumental consequences.
Okay, so we've delved into Oswald's life, explored the evidence, and tried to understand the enduring allure of the conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
But as we wrap up, I keep coming back to this idea of legacy. What does the Kennedy assassination teach us about ourselves, about our world?
That's a question that historians, philosophers, and everyday people have been grappling with for decades. I think on one level, it exposes this deep-seated human need to make sense of chaos, to find meaning in tragedy. Conspiracy theories, even if they're far-fetched, offer that sense of order, of a world where things happen for a reason.
It's like we're wired to look for patterns, for connections, even when they may not exist.
Exactly. And in a way, that search for meaning is what keeps the Kennedy assassination alive, keeps us debating, keeps us asking questions.
But there's also a darker side to this legacy, isn't there? This seed of distrust that was planted has grown into a full-blown crisis of faith in our institutions.
That's a crucial point. The assassination in many ways marked a turning point in American history, a shift towards skepticism, towards questioning authority. And while healthy skepticism is important, it's become increasingly difficult to separate fact from fiction, to have reasoned debate in a world awash in misinformation.
So where do we go from here? How do we honor the memory of JFK, not just with remembrance, but with action, with change?
I think it starts with recognizing the power of our individual choices, the impact they can have on the world around us. It's about fostering empathy, understanding, a willingness to listen to those with whom we disagree.
It's about rebuilding trust in our institutions and our experts in each other.
Exactly. And perhaps most importantly, it's about never losing sight of the fragility of our democracy, the importance of safeguarding our values, of striving for a more just and equitable society.
This deep dive has been a real journey, hasn't it? From the streets of Dallas to the complexities of human nature, the search for truth, and the enduring power of history.
We've only scratched the surface, but hopefully it's sparked your curiosity, challenged your assumptions, and given you a deeper appreciation for the enduring legacy of this tragic event.
And to our listeners, we encourage you to keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep the conversation going. Subscribe to The Deep Dive for more insightful explorations, like this one. We'll be back soon with a new topic ready to take you on another fascinating journey of discovery. Until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep seeking the truth wherever it may lead.